this thing record. And so what I figured I'd start off with is one of the people from the class asked a question, sort of directly to me, and I asked if they could share, and they said, sure. They said, so a personal issue when training under my menstrual period, and the ongoing issue I've been dealing with for many years. Under high intensity training, CrossFit in particular, my period seems to slow down, eventually just stop altogether after 2 days of regular flow. It was never too heavy to start with, and I never had too many cramps, although now, and she's in perimenopause, she gets heavier and slightly longer apart, or sometimes 2 times a month. So some of that sounds kind of familiar to some of the things that we discussed prior. She then goes on to say, I was wondering, regardless of how often I get it now, why does my period stop under heavy training? I've noticed that when I do not train, let's say I'm on vacation or just resting for 4 to 5 days, flow goes on and on as normal. Any ideas? So for those of you, I think at least maybe 2 of you are members of our Inside Scoop subscription newsletter. We're going to actually put out something on a similar topic this coming month. But basically, the thought process that I have is one of 2 things. When training with higher intensity, there may also, in fact, be higher volume as well. And so there's a possibility that this person is moving into or is kind of existing at a borderline of just enough of an energy availability to keep her menstrual cycle full and active in the way that we want it to be. And then when the volume or the intensity increases, she's actually going into a negative energy availability. And as a result of that, the menstrual cycle stops as an energy preservation mechanism, essentially. That's one possibility. In this case, I would say it's probably not the most likely case, though. What is, in my opinion, to be a more likely situation is the following. This is not necessarily something that we've discussed overly well or overly detailed in the course, because it has more to do with sort of central nervous activity, but it's definitely related. So if you followed M2 for long enough, you've probably heard me talk about the autonomic nervous system, which differs from the somatic nervous system. So somatic nervous system is like, if I think to myself, like open my hand, close my hand, swallow, or something like that. It's conscious action-based movements. And so on the flip side of that is the autonomic nervous system, which basically controls so many functions in the body that we never have to think about, but are critical for our life. So for example, I don't have to think to my small intestine, move food, like, contract my small intestine. I don't have to tell my liver, produce bile, or anything like that. Those functions are happening as a result of the autonomic nervous system. So you can subdivide the autonomic nervous system into 2 subdivisions, one of which is called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sometimes, referred to as the rest and digest or the feed and breed system. And then on the flip side of that is you have the parasympathetic and you have the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system we think of as like flight or fight, but I don't like that term perfectly, simply because it gets so connected to like an adrenaline response, and that's the activation of your sympathetic nervous system. And it's not really that. It's any sort of stressful based action, like regardless of whether or not it's a super stressful thing or a moderate stressful thing, that is going to cause activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And so there are studies out there that have looked at this, and we know that the sympathetic nervous system is influenced by the female cycle, so the female menstrual cycle. And on the flip side of that, we know that the sympathetic nervous system has the ability to perhaps halt or stop a lot of these hormones in their production if life is getting essentially too stressful. And the sort of the rationale or the hypothesis that's kind of hard to test would be, think 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, when humans were evolving, if you were experiencing a large amount of stress, regardless of whether or not you were in an energy deficit or not, it probably wasn't a great time to bring another human being into that world. And so it makes some sense to short circuit the female reproductive cycle if life is overly stressful. And so I think in the situation with the question that we got here, that I've seen this enough times that I do believe high intensity training through a methodology such as CrossFit, especially in, in a person who may be mildly predisposed to sympathetic nervous system activation to begin with, does have enough of an opportunity to push that individual over sort of the edge and cause interruption in the production of, it could be anything. It could be decreased estrogen, it could be decreased progesterone, it could be a lack of complete production of FSH or LH spikes. All of those are possibilities that could ultimately lead to the symptom that was being described, which is this short menstrual period where she's only having like 2 days of bleeding. Essentially what's going on there is it's not the bleeding that's being stopped, it's that something earlier on during the buildup of the lining is not happening in robust enough of a fashion. And as a result, the body only requires of 2 days of bleeding essentially to remove all of the tissue. So when she goes and rests, it moves from that period of, it moves from that time frame of, higher intensity training and drops the intensity back down. And now all of a sudden, I'm going to mute you there, Kelly, simply because I'm getting a little bit of an echo on my end. So she goes from training with high intensity, decreases that back down to, say, moderate intensity. The sympathetic nervous system now has a chance to recover more fully. And like basically all of those hormones are fully functional. So, the situation that was asked in this question is a little bit more complicated than that because the person is, moving through perimenopause, like 50 plus years old. So there might be some other aspects like that in play. I've just seen it enough with other clients that I think it's a component. So the question is, what do you do? And like we go into great detail in the article that's coming out next month in the Inside Scoop. I think there's 3 major things. One is just intentionally reducing intensity, but not everybody wants to do that. If you really love CrossFit, if you love training with intensity, I understand that might not be your first or favorite thing to do. Second thing would be think about the post-workout state and moving from moving yourself out of that flight or fight, that sympathetic nervous system overdrive state into more of that rest and digest, feed and breathe. And the way that you can do that is through breathing exercises, meditation, things of that nature. So you finish your workout and instead of like immediately getting in the car and going home and kind of having that activation signal for, the next, 5-6 hours in many cases, you spend 10 minutes, you lay down, you put your feet up on a bench and you just belly breathe for 10 minutes. That'll work in like a major way to help that person get out of the sympathetic nervous system and back into the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the last but not least would just be general stress management activities. Journaling, going for a walk in the woods, has been shown to be very powerful at activating the parasympathetic nervous system. And so, that's another strategy as well to just try to help that person spend less time in this, overly like physical stress state. So obviously that person's not on the call, but hopefully that was a helpful explanation of what potentially could be going on. Any questions from the people that are here on that topic?
Quick question. I missed the beginning of that question. So because I have a similar client who, or from what I could gather, about like someone who's in menopause, she used to like do boot camps constantly. So she was like super jacked when she was younger.
Sure.
With COVID, took time off. And like she's been getting back into it. I honestly think probably what you're saying, the stress side of it is probably the main thing, like getting back into the sympathetic nervous system. But is that kind of what you're talking about with someone that can't quite lose the weight or like lose some of the fat that they've gained since menopause or perimenopause?
Yeah, so losing that last bit of weight during the perimenopause to menopause phase is definitely like a really tough thing to do. I mean, I know the coaches at M2, including myself, have often struggled with it. We talk about it a little bit in the course. We say, hey, like all the basics still apply. The one thing that I didn't mention in my last 10-minute ramble there that I think as an older client that we need to be at least conscious of is remember that as women enter menopause, the hormone DHEA drops pretty dramatically, right? So DHEA is a hormone that one of its major jobs is to counteract the functions of cortisol, right? So cortisol is a stress hormone. Cortisol drives activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And so if that's not being balanced out, by DHEA through basically age-induced decreased production, that might be another reason that's kind of like, playing a role here in that situation. Now, with Melissa's question about like, okay, this woman was in great shape. She went through COVID. Now she's trying to get back into it. She's struggling. I really do think that there's a scientific publication that came out roughly maybe like 18 months ago that metabolism does not decrease between age 20 and 60. Shocking, including in the postmenopause state. There's no decrease in total daily energy expenditure. Here, while I'm talking, I'll see if I can't find the graph. And the question that, like, if you tell that to a menopausal woman, they're like, you're completely nuts. Like, I hit menopause and everything changed. What's going on there? And so here, let me see if I can find it. Of course, it's behind a paywall. Let me see if I can find an image. You'll have to trust me. No decrease between the age of 20 and 60. But what we do know is that this hormone estrogen, which is obviously plummeting during that menopausal state, has the ability to fit into and signal through the leptin receptor. You guys remember what leptin does? Anybody? I know a couple of you have taken some of those other courses and might just be a little bit shy. So leptin is a satiety hormone produced by adipose tissue. But one of the major things that it does, in addition to satiety signals, is that it also drives motivation to move and be active. And so if you have this hormone or this receptor for this hormone that drives satiety and drives movement, and we know that at least on some level, estrogen has the ability to signal through that receptor, not quite as well as leptin does itself, but still really well. And then you take that hormone away, what's going to happen? Decreased movement, increased appetite. Even if a person's not really like consciously changing any of their actions, there's definitely the possibility for subconscious change in movement and eating behavior. And then last but not least, I touch about this a little bit, but during menopause, due to the fact that these sex hormones drop, women all of a sudden go from a more female fat distribution pattern, which is kind of like hips and thighs and glutes. And all of a sudden, it starts to accumulate more in the midsection, which is what we'll call like a male dominant, but basically it's just sort of a lack of estrogen pattern of fat. And so their weight may not change dramatically, but they may look visually quite different with weight gain in a section of their body that they're not used to having it. So I think all of these three things combined are kind of like the problem children that women in menopause experienced. And as nutrition coaches, are going to have to deal with. It's still, at the end of the day, it really just comes down to smashing on those fundamentals: high protein, tons of movement outside of the gym, high quality foods. I do think a general avoidance of processed fructose is good in the menopause state. And then one of the big things we've really seen success with that demographic, outside of just getting them to move more, is cold water. So they really struggle with thermoregulation. And if you're overly hot, especially, you're generally going to try to sit more. Again, very much not a conscious action. So getting older women to just drink ice water, it sounds so stupid, but it works. But it is a really hard demographic to work with. So yeah, you're not alone there, Melissa, at all. Is that helpful? Cool, awesome. What other questions do we have for you that have logged in? Rachel, Nicole, Emily, Kelly. Don't be shy.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So I think in week 2, when you're talking about cortisol, you
Mhm.
mentioned some of the changes that can occur in the brain as a result of that. Is that reversible?
Yeah, that's a good question that I don't necessarily know, like the answers are going to be perfect for you. So, right. So the basic premise here, and I think it's a scary one, is excessive amounts of production of cortisol has the ability to reshape brain function and brain structure to some extent. And it basically can wire somebody into a higher stress state. Also kind of change their responsiveness to stress. So most of those studies, thankfully, of course, have been done in animal models where they'll stress like mice or rats. They'll put them in like water, which they really don't like early in life, and then they'll look at brain patterning and stuff. Now, there's been some correlative studies in humans, of course, to say like, okay, we're not going to intentionally stress human beings to the point that their brains rewire. That would be hard to get past an ethics committee. But they see a lot of similar brain rewiring in people that have experienced relatively large amounts of trauma early in life, or have gone to war and things of that nature and really dealt with some serious things. What they see is a rewiring of the brain in a similar fashion. It's hard, of course, you can't take cortisol out of a person, but you can block those things. You can block those signals in the animal models and really start to drive it back to say cortisol is the culprit there. I'm aware of 2 studies essentially where they basically took the animals out of that stressful environment and then look for just changes in general behavior. Of course, you can do things like brain scans and stuff like that, but a lot of the structural analyses of the brain does require dissection. So can't do that twice on a single animal. So we really don't have a great answer for that question, but I think in general, the thought process in the field is that there are aspects that are reversible and there are aspects that are not fully reversible. And I think if you talk, this is so far out of my realm of expertise, but I've talked to some really smart people, neurologists and things over the years about this topic. And they'll basically say like, if you've ever had the misfortune to an extent to work with somebody who's gone through early life trauma, there are things that you can work with to help them out of some of these states. And then there are things that they're just kind of like at that point embedded in sort of their psyche and who they are. And they think that a lot of that is brain rewiring. Coming back to a conversation we were just having, there are some monitors out there that people can use that look at a person's sympathetic versus parasympathetic sort of brain function. And you can take people that had early life trauma, physical abuse and things of that nature, and look at them, and at baseline, even without exercise, without anything acutely stressful going on, they are living in a sympathetic nervous system activated state, versus if you were to take the average person walking across who's never gone through that, they'll spend the vast majority of their day in a parasympathetic state. And so you just start to think to yourself, well, if they're living in that state already to begin with, without somebody, having them do high intensity training or getting into a car crash or dealing with stress, school, kids, whatever, what does it look like when they are, and how much are you really going to be able to rewire that? Or was it pre-programmed in due to those early life events? So I don't have a great answer to your question, but I do think it's one worth asking. And I do think that there's, like I said, there's parts that are fixable and parts that are not. So did that help at all?
Yeah, that makes sense.
If I can find the studies offline after we finish, I'll drop them into the Slack chat.
Okay, great. Thanks.
What other questions do we have? I know Rach up there is being quiet. She's got her kiddo who we saw earlier. Rachel, do you have any questions?
No, I don't. But I was just going to say that I was actually just typing to you that sort of a realm that you were just talking about with the child trauma and sorry, that's my child, and and the brain changes. Like that's 100% correct. And
right,
like you're saying, there's elements that you can, I guess, help, and then there's elements that don't help too much.
Yeah, completely, for sure. So yeah, and don't worry about the kid. I just put 2 to bed right now with my wife, so I understand all too well. I'm on the flip side of my day. Rach is on the other side of the world in Australia, and very lucky to have her join us. Other questions or comments?
I do have one. Right. Hi. I was actually at a neurosport conference in January, and they were talking a lot about polyvagal theory, which is similar to what it is that you just referenced. So when speaking to, and I haven't referenced any of my notes from the the course right yet before this question, but I thought I would ask it since it seems timely. How do you deal with levels of burnout and that kind of like resetting of the baseline sympathetic, parasympathetic freeze type response that people have that are exposed to chronic stress? I work with the first responder community, and you know, I know that it does deplete a lot of vitamins, you know, for people that affects their recovery and inflammation. And that in turn can affect the way that their muscles are responding to exercise. So, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I can't say that I'm an expert in any way, shape, or form on this topic, but the things that like, so I work with a number of first responders, people that work night shifts in the medical community. And so that's probably the closest I can comment. So generally our strategy and structure working with those individuals is to try and think about having them become as aware and involved in the process of their work together as absolutely possible. And so as an example, so I work with a couple of people who often will pull all-nighters essentially as a result of their work. And so what in that situation we do is we basically say, like, listen, if you didn't get more than 4 hours of sleep the night before, then we're gonna really push you to take that next day and drop the intensity from your training down pretty dramatically. And instead of going to the gym, maybe we just go for like a 4 or 5 mile walk. Or if you're going to go to the gym, it's a pure bodybuilding day, you know, no intensity of any sort, basically to try to get them to move, but also to listen to their body. From a nutritional perspective, you know, again, most of these people that are living in the heightened state of stress response, this kind of falls back into the gut biology course, but the stress of that situation through the sympathetic nervous system interacting with the enteric nervous system, which is another part of the autonomic nervous system, slows digestion down in a pretty dramatic and meaningful way. And the best example I could probably give to somebody that's listening to this, unless you work one of those jobs, is if you ever had like a big exam, or maybe you went to go do a competition that was meaningful to you, whatever, 5K run, something like that, and your appetite just disappeared. Like you looked at food and you're like, nope, want nothing to do with it, you know. Or on the flip side of that, you have to go to the bathroom like nonstop, right? Just constantly. You ever go to a CrossFit competition or any real competition, like the bathroom lines are just out of the world in the athlete section. And I've seen the same thing at like collegiate track meets and stuff like that. They're just constantly going to the bathroom. So basically what's happening is that the body's saying like, hey, listen, digestion right now, not a priority in any way, shape, or form. So we're going to decrease the hunger response and really slow digestion down because it's just not important enough over a 24 or even 48-hour time span to survival. And on the flip side, anything that's sort of in the latter stages, we'll say in the large intestine, like we don't need this right now. Let's just flush that out. And so it pushes sort of the eject button on the other side of your intestinal tract. And so, like Kelly was saying, like this can impact things like nutrient absorption and things of that nature because food is not being as well digested, and anything in the large intestine is kind of being pushed out a little bit more aggressively than normal. And despite the fact that we think of the large intestine as sort of like a waste excretion system, it actually is really important for the absorption of some micronutrients, including B vitamins. And so, you know, that's problematic in a meaningful way. The ways that you can work around that from a nutritional perspective, other than the stuff that we've already discussed, which would be stress management techniques, breathing, box breathing, which is, you know, a powerful tool that I think was originally developed by Navy SEALs, is to simplify the diet down pretty dramatically. So as an example, I tell many of the people that fall underneath that demographic that I want them to increase their usage of like their crock pots, their slow cookers, their pressure cookers, and make soups, stews, things like that, where the cooking process is either very long or very, very intense, such that the food is really broken down almost before they even go to eat it. And so the digestion is much, much easier and simpler on the body, especially for something like broccoli or carrots or something like that, which normally would take a large amount of time to break down and digest and absorb. The cooking process essentially does that for them. You can also use things like bone broth and stuff like that as well, but I think in general that's the best approach that I have. So, a lot of the question that Kelly was asking, falls under more of the role of a psychotherapist and things of that nature. But it's just something as nutrition coaches that you want to be aware of and have a tool in your back pocket to be able to bring to that conversation with that person. So, good question, Kelly. Did that help at all?
Yeah, it does help. And just, I think that's really insightful to recommend foods like soups and foods that are more broken down. That's really interesting.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, something that I originally picked up back in the day and just kind of made sense. When I do it all the time. I also do that with people after they're coming out of surgery, because again, in that situation, their digestive tract is really slowed down. The drugs, the analgesics and anesthetics and things of that nature also massively slow digestion. So that's another demographic just to put in the back of your brain of, if you know anybody coming out of surgery, that's a good time to use soups and stews, because they're not going to want to do anything with whole foods. I recently had a client who had her shoulder repaired. She's a CrossFit athlete. And she sent me a picture and she's like, it looks like I'm 4 months pregnant. And she literally, like, she had like a huge round belly because of the fact that she hadn't gone to the bathroom in like 5 days due to the massive amount of constipation as a result of the pain medications, as well as the drugs that were used during the surgery in and of itself. So we got it all worked out, but yeah, it was interesting. Other questions?
Okay, I have another one.
Yeah.
This will show how far behind I am on the lectures.
There's no judgment here. You're in a safe spot, I promise.
Okay, cool. I was like, I don't want to miss the Q&A, but also I'm so behind. But I've heard like a mix of things on, like when women are on their cycle, like on the menstrual cycle, like eating different types of food or different types of workouts. Mm-hmm. What's your research? Because I've heard both, where it's like, doesn't really matter, or it like matters a ton.
It's a great question, and it's a really complicated answer. And the best answer is that we need more research to be done. And it really depends on who you ask. And having worked with, so like the vast majority of my clientele are women. The vast majority of them exercise as a major component of their life. And I can tell you that it definitely seems to make an impact. It does not appear to just be sort of psychological. So they're not like making it up or anything like that, even though a recent paper tried to come out and say, oh, that a lot of this is just in women's heads. And it was a female-led study. So but yeah, I saw that and I immediately thought to myself, well, what are the demographics? And I think that's a big component here. So if a person is relatively untrained, so they're just getting into exercise, they're just getting into fitness, and they're not going to have a huge impact on their training. They're not going to have a huge impact on their ability to go to the gym and work out with intensity, just because they don't really know how to work out with intensity yet. The more and more advanced an athlete becomes, that's where I really do see impacts on physical performance in sort of those 7 days prior to the onset of menses, onset of a period. Basically due to the thought process is the increased amount of progesterone in the body at that point. That raises core body temperature. So if you're working out in a hotter environment, that's not going to be helpful, right? More likely to overheat. That's hard to control, but like you can keep yourself cool, drink lots of ice water like we were talking about earlier. The other thing is that increase in progesterone raises core body temperature, which raises metabolism. And so I simply a lot of times think that if a person is tracking their nutrition and they don't change their macros at all, they're not really aware of their menstrual cycle, that if the metabolism increases by 200 calories a day over the course of a 7-day period, a 7-day week, we'll say, it's close to 1,500 calories, if not more, that they've accidentally put themselves into a little bit of a deficit from. So that's not going to be helpful. And then the last component is there is sort of a thought process that the inflammatory response. So as a woman enters into that last week of her menstrual cycle, the body does become more inflamed, and this does produce a mild insulin resistance. So if you ever really want to get it deep into the subject, you can go to like CVS or Walgreens and buy like this is over-the-counter glucometer, and just take like a morning finger prick of blood and take your blood glucose. And what you'll see is in the last week prior to your period is that your fasting blood glucose will go up anywhere from like mid 80s up to like sometimes in the low 100s, which is pretty high levels in all honesty. And that's just the body not being nearly as insulin sensitive during that state. And so it's a little bit harder to get glucose inside of the muscles as well if you're trying to exercise. And so some people would say that in that situation, the best thing that you can do is decrease your training intensity, fuel with more fats and less carbs. And that's great, but obviously a large component of the demographic that M2 hits does focus on high intensity training. And so in the situation, what I found is that simply eating more food, so increasing caloric intake by like 200 calories, which can be, we'll say 25 grams of fat, or 25 grams of carbs, and roughly, like what would that be? 10, 12 grams of fat. That can fix a lot of the problems as well. And then the second thing is just macronutrient timing. So really paying attention to pre and post workout. So the body actually has this time period in that post workout state where it doesn't need insulin to get glucose inside of a muscle fiber. It just does it sort of passively. And so that's something you can take advantage of as an athlete, as well as punch a bunch of carbs into that post workout state when the body is naturally absorbing them into the muscle fibers and kind of bypass a lot of these issues. So that's another aspect. So to come back to your question, I think it was Melissa. So eat more food, pay attention to workout timing with your nutrition. If you want to modify training, I think it can help, but by no means do I want the message to be that for 7 or 14 days of a cycle, women shouldn't exercise with intensity. I think that's complete utter bullshit. I think it's a bad message to send to women that they're weak for 7 out of 28 days. No, that's bullshit. Things just might feel a little bit heavier that day. The good news is that on the flip side, you're actually better primed for longer endurance efforts in those days as well. So, you make the most of it. Did that answer your question at all?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Cool.
That was crucial. One other question, which
I'll give you
I'm
one
sure...
more. I'm gonna interrupt you. I apologize. So one
you're good. No
thing
worries.
is that I don't know if you've been exposed to this individual before, but I'll give you another person. I'm not about trying to corner the market here on evidence-based nutrition coaching. So this woman here, I'm screen sharing if you have the ability to see it. Her name is Alyssa Olenek. She is a PhD in nutritional sciences, if I'm not mistaken, exercise metabolism and female physiology. She specifically studied the impact of the menstrual cycle on performance, as well as I think she's done some research on hormonal birth control too. So definitely a really good follow. She's high energy. She's a very entertaining person, but more important than that, she's extraordinarily smart. And I think a good resource for everyone out there, but especially for female athletes. So worth a follow. So I apologize for interrupting, but I wanted to make sure we got that. So do you have another follow-up question there, Melissa? May have lost.
So sorry, I cut out for a second.
It's all good.
I'm back. Sorry.
Did you see?
I was walking my dog,
account that I posted out there?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that was perfect because I was going to follow up with a birth control question, which I figured is severely understudied as well. So I'll definitely check.
What's your question on the birth control?
Well, just how I guess that would affect fitness as well. Obviously, like if someone were to, let's say, do the kind where they can cut out, if they can cut out, like, hey, chills, sorry. If they can cut out like the birth control for like a week or whatever, and then go back to normal, like, is that still simulating it, or is just everything completely different,
So,
I
so
guess.
just to ask, be sure I understand your question. So basically you were saying if you were
Yes.
on birth control and then you were to
Mhm.
kind of go into like that, like a 1 week period where you come off sort of like for the body to induce what we'll call a period. Is that
Right.
what you're asking? Was that your question? I
Yes,
apologize for the
exactly.
confusion.
Oh, no, you're good. I know I'm cutting out, so I apologize. But yeah, no, that's, you cut out for a second, but yeah, basically, like, is that still simulating, like having the cutout
Yeah,
for a
good
week of,
question. Good
like, is
question.
that still
Okay.
simulating it, the same thing?
So slightly different. All right. So you may have to rewatch this when you have a better connection, but hopefully we'll get the message across. So when a woman is on birth control, there's obviously like 50 different types at this point. We cover this a little bit towards the end of the course, as you'll see when you get there. But the key things are how much estrogen is in the birth control. So first generation, second generation, third generation, those are all really critical. And then is there estrogen present? So there's estrogen, and then there's estrogen and progesterone, and then there's just progesterone birth control options as well. And the presence of or absence of progesterone is going to be important too. Basically, what happens in a situation when a woman is taking birth control and then comes off of it for that 1 week to induce, we'll say, a period, it's not in that situation the same thing, because what was going on before is that the body was increasing the amount of progesterone that it was producing up to the sort of high hormone phase, roughly 7 days before the menstrual cycle ends, and then it starts to decrease. And so what's been going on in a woman who's been taking, we'll say, second generation birth control, is that there's a constant level of estrogen and progesterone going along the whole time. And then she comes off that pill, and then it goes and it just falls off. So it's a very different physiological response. And in that situation, the changes to physiology are definitely different. There's probably a different thing that's causing an increase in hunger, different thing that's causing like cramping and stuff like that, in addition to all the complexities of birth control. What I would say in general with birth control, like I was saying earlier, is that we need more studies, but there is some early evidence that if somebody wants to be on birth control for the prevention of pregnancies, or for another medical reason, that the second generation line seems to have the least impact on athletic performance. So I am not here to tell women what to do about whether or not they should or shouldn't be on birth control. That is not my role in the world. But I can tell you that studies are coming out that seemingly are pointing in that direction. I would just say I would like to see some more of them in well-trained individuals, as opposed to like novice lifters or novice athletes. So yeah, I can go that direction. So I don't know if I answered your question there, but if not, let me know.
Yeah. No, that was great. That's,
Cool.
I feel like, far more information than I've been able to find from like searching online. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Kelly asked a good question in the chat. She says, what types of vitamins are good to make sure are supplemented when an athlete is dealing with burnout from work, or other physical or psychological stressors? I mean, being bluntly honest, I don't know that a vitamin or a mineral is going to solve that problem, Kelly. You know, like you mentioned earlier, there can be micronutrient deficiencies in that population due to gastrointestinal changes and things of that nature. The best bet, honestly, is to get a good, high quality multivitamin. Most of them are garbage. I'm not here to promote any one company's products, but the best one that I've ever seen or used is the multivitamin from a company called Momentous. They just signed a deal with CrossFit, but I don't have any connection to them. They used to give us a discount code, but we got rid of that for for legal reasons, to keep things simple with recommendations. But yeah, I would say just like honestly go with the broad multi of high quality, as opposed to something you're going to find at like a local GNC. That's the best approach that I can think, because honestly, like, you know, with burnout and stuff like that, we could talk about B vitamins, carnosine, you know, GABA, all of that stuff, which can be supplemented, but it's just going to be so variable from person to person, depending on what their burnout's caused by, how long they've been dealing with it, what their diet looks like, what their exercise looks like, and what their sleep looks like. There's no universal prescription that I'm aware of. Other questions, other comments? No need to be shy.
I have another question.
Go for it, Emily.
So kind of on top of what you've been talking about changing workouts, or not changing workouts based on cycles, what would you say for someone who has hormone problems, either like high or low cortisol, but they compete, and changing workouts or like doing something different really isn't in the cards for them?
Yeah. So just let me make sure I was going to say it back to you just to make sure I understand. So when talking about an athlete, we suspect they have elevated amounts of cortisol as a result perhaps of their training, but their training is also critical to help them get better within the sport. They, within CrossFit, it's just so much shit you got to do. But even with other sports, right? So like swimming is a 4 or 5 hour sport, crew or things of that nature, generally multiple hours, 2-a-days for many collegiate sports and things of that nature. So let's not just think about functional fitness, but other endeavors as well. So what, that's a question essentially, like, what do I do in that situation to try to manage it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, great question. So the scientific evidence around, okay, so let's be clear. If we could control everything, the best thing that they can do, eat more food, sleep 8 hours a night, rest, take rest days, at least one full rest day a week. Ideally, I think in many situations, most athletes benefit from a second one, not a recovery day, but another full rest day where the best that they do is go for a walk. No weight vests, no sled drags, no buddy carries. Trust me, I've seen athletes try to twist my words every way possible. I think that's a great starting point. And so, on top of that, though, I really do think that that there is something compelling about high quality ashwagandha supplements. I've talked about it on social media before. It is such it sounds like a hippy dippy thing, right? The name basically makes you think of magic mushrooms. But it is a relatively well-studied supplement that seemingly has benefits on cortisol production. And so, taking somewhere between 300 to 400 milligrams late afternoon and then again before bed is another great sort of like band-aid to put on a situation. I do also think, though, kind of bringing it all the way back to what we started talking about at the top of the hour, that helping that athlete get out of the flight or fight sympathetic nervous system state of those workouts as fast as possible is something that's not necessarily being talked about enough or used as a coaching strategy. So coaches will say, hey, go do these workouts and stuff like that. I think that the best coaches out there are now saying, when you're done, 5 minutes of calm walking on a treadmill, or 10 minutes laying down with your feet on the bench, just belly breathing, right? No social media, no phone use, no nothing. 5 minutes of box breathing. Jason Leiden, who's a really good friend of mine, he owns Conquer Athlete, which is a great programming community. He's a big proponent for all of his athletes to be journaling, right? All of them. So just writing in a journal for 3, 5, 10, 15 minutes a day, to just kind of help them deal with thoughts and get out of the stressed out, state that the workouts produce. So those are sort of things that you can do on top of the basics. But again, the vast majority of the benefits are going to come from a dedicated sleep routine, a good nutritional approach where we are fueling that athlete enough. There's nothing that I've seen faster to spike cortisol than trying to train a caloric deficit. I am damn near militant about telling my higher volume athletes or higher intensity level athletes, when they say, oh, I'm feeling fluffy and I want to cut, I'm like, cool, but I'm going to talk to your coach because we're going to drop your training down to an hour a day of like strength and gymnastics, and then we're going to get like 15,000 steps. We're not doing this CrossFit shit for 4 hours a day and also trying to cut. That usually ends the conversation pretty quickly about cutting. So that's kind of where my head is as it relates to kind of managing the cortisol response. There are no like magic pills. Even the ashwagandha, it works pretty well, but it's not like a cure-all by any stretch of the imagination. Did you have anything specifically on that topic you wanted to ask about that you're thinking about doing or doing with your people that you work with?
No, that was a good answer. That helped a lot.
Cool. Cool.
Thank you.
Of course. Other questions? I'll give you guys 10 more seconds, and then if no one says anything, we'll move on.
I have kind of a non-hormone health specific related question.
I love it. Go for it.
So I am actually not a nutrition coach or work anywhere near nutrition. I did the course because I thought it would be interesting and wanted to dive more into it.
I hope it was.
It was very interesting. I enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, good.
But I was just wondering, like, if so my education is like nothing to do with any
Sure.
sort of body or nutrition. So
Yeah.
what would you recommend if like I was looking to get into a nutrition coaching path? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a couple of people on this call that have probably kind of taken that same step. Nicole, are you in the United States?
No, I am in Canada.
Canada. Okay, Canada's a little bit trickier, but not impossible by any stretch of the imagination. So not even really that much trickier, to be honest with you. So the crazy thing about it is, even myself years ago, I thought to myself, oh, okay, so to be a quote unquote nutrition coach, there must be this formal certification process with governmental X, Y, and Z. And while there's a couple of states that do have those rules, like ironically, like Mississippi, so and a couple of others, for the vast majority of it, as long as you are not in any way, shape, or form trying to work with people on like a true health or medical issue, basically it's sort of like the wild west of being able to kind of talk to people about, hey, well, what are you eating and things of that nature. And so companies like M2, but also Precision Nutrition, WAG, but even bigger organizations like NASM and things like that, what you're really thinking about is like a training and methodology, and figuring out what methodology is sort of aligned with your beliefs, etc. So, for me, very much like an evidence-based practitioner person, like 90% of, if not more, of what I say, I can go find a study online to support, right? And say, here's why I'm recommending why you do what you do. There's other organizations out there that are a little bit more, loose with their definition of evidence-based. If you ever wanted to become, truly involved in sort of working with people that do have more sort of health concerns, then that's going down the path of like becoming what we call a registered dietitian. And that's like another career entirely. That's usually like a 3 or 4 year program. But then you can work with patients, you can work in a hospital, you can literally get a job where they will pay you a salary as opposed to going out there and finding clients and stuff like that. It's another level of training. I think it's great. There are many really great registered dietitians. I've also met some that really didn't seemingly absorb anything during their training, and I had to teach them, or kind of try to teach them everything, and eventually just kind of didn't work out. Rachel's worked with one of my coaches at M2, Kenzie. She's a registered dietitian. She's great. She could tell you all about sort of her thoughts on the program and the process. Now, if you want to just learn about nutrition overall, in addition to sort of these informal sort of studies and methodology, which is like what we do, what Precision Nutrition does, etc., there are, of course, like degrees that you can get in the world of nutritional sciences. So like I was showing earlier, that woman, Dr. Alessa Olenek, she went and got a PhD, in nutritional sciences and physiology, essentially. You can get masters, all sorts of things of that nature. There are programs out there. So it just kind of depends on like where you want to go with it, what level of training you want to get, and what kind of doors that will open for you on the flip side. So, if you want to become just a nutrition coach, like you're going to be hunting for clients and trying to get people to work with you and doing a lot of what I did for the last, 12, 14 years. With those more advanced degrees, there are jobs and positions open for those individuals, and you can still go out there and work with clients as well. And then at the highest level of training, maybe we won't say doesn't make them the best coaches per se, but these registered dietitians, those are really, that's a career catered to helping people with nutrition, but more from like a a patient demographic as opposed to a healthy person. So did that answer your question at all?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Anything else? Well then, thank you guys all so much for taking, an hour out of your day, or when Rach was here, her morning over in Australia. I hope you enjoyed the live Q&A. And if you, for some reason, have a question that pops in your mind as soon as we sign off, the Slack chat is there for essentially like the next 9 months or whatever it ends up being, 10 months, for you guys to send me questions if you have them. So please take full advantage of that. But otherwise, have a great night, guys. Bye.